Welcome to the Brett Snodgrass Podcast. This is Brett Snodgrass, and I got a great show for you guys today. I got two very special men, Jon Sanders and Hughes, with me today. They are the co-founders of Entrepastors, where they are teaching and coaching and consulting pastors how to make extra income because they've been pastors themselves, and they know that pastors many times struggle financially. So they are on a mission to help pastors make additional income that is not from their congregation or their church. So this is a really cool interview. This is not only for pastors as well. It can be for anyone who has a W-2 job that wants to make some extra income, and check out Entrepastors. So go over to our new titled YouTube channel, Iron Deep. So our YouTube channel is now called Iron Deep, and if you want to subscribe to that channel, we minister to marketplace leaders that want a deeper desire in their faith, want more purpose in their life, and we're putting out content that really talks to that man that really fits that profile, that wants more purpose, significance, and that deep intimacy with the Father. So go over to irondeep.com. Also check out our website, irondeep.com. Our YouTube channel was Iron Deep. Our website's irondeep.com. And this is our new website, and we, again, have content on there. We are inviting people to possibly join our first retreat coming up. So you guys want to go check out our very first Iron Deep retreat that we're inviting marketplace men into to that retreat. It's going to be an amazing experience, so check that out as well at irondeep.com. Now I want to introduce you to our guests on today's podcast, Jon Sanders and Hughes. What's going on, guys?
What's up,
man,
Brett?
Good to see you, Brett.
Yeah, man, I'm really looking forward to this episode because you guys are doing something very unique, very different. I mean, I interviewed a lot of business people. I've also interviewed people in full-time ministry and missions, and you guys are really just trying to put those two together with Entrepastors. And this is something that's honestly been on my heart the more I've talked to people in full-time ministry about, I mean, and you guys are going to dig into the struggle that they go through about how can I support my family? How can I pay the bills? How can I do this plus lead my ministry? And it's just a huge struggle, and we're going to dive into that today. But before I get started, let's just kind of introduce yourself. So, Jon, I'll start with you. Jon Sanders. Who is Jon Sanders?
Man, I am a child of the Most High God. That's who I am. But I do a lot of I wear a lot of different hats. I've been in pastoral ministry. I'm a professional full-time firefighter. I'm a podcaster. I'm an author. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. So there's a lot of directions we can go with the answer to that question, who is Jon Sanders? But at the end of the day, I really feel called to serve people as I serve my God. So that's really the simple answer.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's you or Les, but one of you does multiple podcasts. Is that?
We both do. We both have had multiple podcasts.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So I want to dig into that before we talk about those podcasts. Les, you, man, who is Les Hughes?
Well, I would amen what Jon said. A few years ago, I would have led with, I'm a pastor probably, but now we both understand that there's just so much more to what it means to be a child of God first, and then also have the role of pastor and husband and dad and now granddad for both of us. And, what we've done in this pilgrimage is just, I want to be a servant. And I thought for a while, like early on in my young adult years, that was going to be exclusively as in a pastor's role at a local church. I learned sometime after that I was in some ways trying to limit God in that. So he's done exceedingly abundantly above all that I could have asked or imagined. And I know that Jon would say the same thing, and he's not finished with us. I'm a work in progress, but in a nutshell, that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys for introducing yourself and being on the show today. And like I said, you guys are on podcast. So what's the name of, Jon, you go ahead and start. What's the name of your podcast?
Well, the Entrepastors podcast is the one that I'm really putting my focus on now. But where I really got started in podcasting many years ago was a show called the Small Town Big Church Podcast. And it was a show for small town rural church pastors. And the big idea behind the show was we serve a God who wants to do big things in small places. That just because you're serving in a small church or in a rural country context does not mean that you've been called to something inferior or less than. But what if God was actually looking for a generation of leaders who wanted to believe him for big things in that context? And so that was really a lot of the content. I did that for 8 years. I just kind of walked away from that podcast here in February of 2022. And so I did 300 and some episodes and just connected with pastors all over the country as a result of that. I also did one for firefighters for a few years. I did one called the Fire Inside podcast. We created about 80 some episodes for kind of the mental health resilience in the first responder community. We shared a lot of stories of firefighters and law enforcement officers around the country who've been involved in some really difficult, dark times and shared their stories of hope, how they came through on the other side. So I've had a few different podcasts over the years.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I love, that's why I do the podcast. You just meet some really interesting people, talk about some awesome topics. Probably wouldn't be talking to you guys today if I didn't have the podcast. So it's really cool. Les, I know you have one or multiple podcasts as well.
Yeah, I have two. One is called Pastors Leadership Podcast, where I just pour into other pastors and we talk about, leadership and ministry stuff related to the local church and leading people. And then the other is one that I actually do with my wife. Her name is Paige, and she's a pastor's daughter and now been a pastor's wife for about 3 decades. And she's got a lot of wisdom, especially for young women. And so that podcast is called In the Meanwhile. And we talk about what God does in the meanwhile. Like, a lot of times in scripture, there'll be a narrative or something going on over here, and then the writer will say, meanwhile, and this is what's really happening. This is what they can't see. And so we really try to help people have faith during the meanwhile times. I've actually pushed pause on those for now because John and I have a tiger by the tail with Entrepastors, and we're finding more and more need out there, and it's keeping us pretty busy in a good way. But that's what we're really focusing on now.
No, that's really awesome. And I love that you are really pouring into pastors, because it's funny how I'm not a pastor, like leading a congregation or church in that sense, I guess. But whenever I feel troubled or I'm like, oh, I need some help, I need to talk to someone, we all say, oh, maybe I should talk to my pastor. But very little do we think that, well, pastors, they need help. They need to lean on people. They need coached. They need help too. And you guys are doing that and pouring into them. And you guys are both pastors. But what was that even like for you? Did you feel like you had trouble leaning on people? You always had to be leading and pouring in. And what was that like for you, Jon?
Well, ministry can be a very lonely place for pastors, in part because leadership can be lonely. I say can be because it doesn't have to be. Loneliness and isolation is also a choice, but it's easy for pastors to drift into that loneliness and isolation. The cure to that, or the answer, is to be intentional about finding some community and surrounding yourself with a band of brothers and sisters that can walk beside you. The problem is, for most pastors, they don't find that band of brothers or sisters within their church. And it's not to say anything bad about the people they're leading or the church. It's just the dynamics make it really difficult for a pastor, regardless of how good the intentions are and how much the people love them and they love their people. There's just a certain level of vulnerability that is really hard for most pastors to go to with the people that they're leading.
Yeah.
So we want to provide that community for them that supports them, especially on this journey of the entrepreneurial thing we're talking about, but even beyond, just to church leadership in general.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I mean, really just any leaders. For me, I've led a business for 15 years, and yeah, I mean, it's really hard to have the vulnerability to be able to talk with my employees, for example. So so let's just talk about Entrepastors. So you guys co-founded this organization, and this is really an organization that you're serving pastors because you're seeing a problem. And I've had other people on the podcast, maybe not pastors per se, but people in the mission field, and they're raising money and trying to raise support, right? And they're struggling financially. So when did this idea come up? Obviously, you guys have experienced this yourself, but talk to us about this problem with pastors and this financial security that they're facing.
Well, personally, when my wife and I began serving together in our young adult years, there weren't a ton of needs, I mean, and we had such a strong sense of calling and love for the Lord and his local church. We felt called somewhere. We just go. And I mean, we talked about compensation, but don't know that it would have mattered a whole lot. We would have found a way. We did find a way, to make it work. But as you grow, as your family grows and those needs grow and life just happens, it's not always true that the level of compensation grows at the same pace. In fact, I'd say most of the time it's probably not true for a pastor and his family. And so Jon and I, independently from one another, began, I think, to look for solutions like that in our own life. And among those things are, we want to be able to serve and do ministry and not just be worried about a paycheck and paying the bills, and certainly never go somewhere primarily because of compensation. And sadly, that's a big factor sometimes, probably larger than it needs to be. So independently, we began going through that, and we both have an entrepreneurial spirit anyway. And so when we actually met one another in a mastermind that we're both in, and through this group, we began to have some conversations and get to know one another, and quickly realized that we shared this passion / burden, I guess you'd say. And we just started dreaming and saying, what if, and put the skill sets that we've kind of developed independently of one another together and said, let's just start Entrepastors and go with this thing. So we did.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So what was the mastermind group? Was it a business group?
Well, really, it's with Dan Miller. I don't know if your audience knows who that is. He wrote the book 48 Days to the Work You Love and has a really large podcast and following. But so he has a mastermind that Les and I are both a part of. So it's a holistic mastermind. I mean, we certainly focus on business and entrepreneurship, but we focus on life and just growth all around. So it's a really, really dynamic group of people that we get to be a part of in that group.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I love mastermind groups as well. So Jon, why don't you just talk about your entrepreneurial spirit? So Les said you guys both kind of have this entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, have you always just been interested in business or marketplace or creating something out of nothing? Like, talk to us about that.
I have, but I didn't realize how much of an entrepreneur I really was. For years, I've always been drawn to podcasts, books, stories of business and, the companies that blow up with an awesome product or something that's innovative or disruptive. Like I've just always been drawn to that. On the church side of things, I became a church planter, and we planted and led a church that grew into 6 different locations. And looking back on it now, I can realize and recognize how God used the entrepreneurial wiring in me to create something that was not there, to build the systems, the team around that, and to grow it into multiple locations. I've always loved the startup. I mean, I start things. It's what I do. And so I didn't realize that those are all parts of being an entrepreneur until I'm a little bit older in life and look back and realize, I've been an entrepreneur all along. The problem is, at least when it comes to pastoring, there's not a very recognized path for pastors to run on who are entrepreneurs. There's this dichotomy that I think is a very flawed dichotomy that says you can either choose ministry and serving God with your life, and that means full-time work for a church or be a missionary or maybe a nonprofit charity or something, or you can go out into this secular realm where this icky, money-making, profitable thing called business takes place. I've come to realize that is a really flawed dichotomy. I don't think God views it that way. I don't think he sees this breakdown of sacred versus secular. So I love the idea of freeing up pastors to do a little bit of both, like to have, your obedience to the calling that God has placed upon your life within the context of a local church, but then to get out in the marketplace and flex some of those entrepreneurial muscles that he put inside of you to do some things there as well. So that's kind of my story of entrepreneurialism in ministry.
Yeah. Les, you want to piggyback on that a little bit? Do you find that pastors have some sort of hang up or fear of trying to make money, of trying to start a business, of how people might view them from their congregation?
You know what? It's a great question, Brett, and it really depends on what their background is. Like there are people in our community or people that we talked with that had kind of a traditional background that Jon just described. All right, maybe somebody that's been in employment at a full-time church or ministry. Here's what happened just personally. Several years ago, for lots of reasons, I just felt led to walk away from a local church ministry. And what I noticed when I did that is I didn't stop having the heart of a pastor,
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people now that even whether they're employed by a local church or not, God's called them to serve people in a certain way. And now, fortunately for us, I'm a full-time local church pastor again now. And I cut my teeth in the marketplace as a grocery store manager earlier in life. So I've had feet in both of those worlds. But when Jon mentioned a moment ago that there's this false, a chasm between those two worlds. For example, in the New Testament, there was no such, secular and sacred. It was all sacred in those brothers and sisters' eyes back then. And whatever they did, whatever you do in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Paul addressed doing your work with all diligence as unto the Lord, because it's the Lord Christ whom you serve, not an earthly, boss, or in that case, master. So that was just personally how that began to evolve with us. And now, but what I was getting at is it depends on your background. If that's your background, then there's usually some mindset shifts that need to take place. And so we come alongside guys and try to help. But it's interesting that we also know people. One person in particular, I'm thinking about Ryan, Jon. Ryan had been in the marketplace first and actually stepped in to pastor a very small rural congregation in Indiana, never really expecting or wanting them to pay him anything. And he's very entrepreneurial. He's got several businesses and he is killing it in the marketplace.
Wow.
And to him, there's no mindset stuff at all. It's like, this is just what I do. But he didn't come through the traditional track to where he had all those other voices. That's what I'm trying to say.
It seems like we pick up our baggage when we come from the church into the business world. We bring baggage. When we come from business into the church world, we think a little bit more open-handedly about how this stuff works. But we pick up a lot of mindset stuff, with this concept of full-time Christian service, what that means, that the calling that, most pastors would say they feel on their life. And it's a real thing. I mean, I feel like it is a real calling. But I've come to realize everybody has a calling on their life. We all are in ministry. So someone who's out selling insurance or fighting fires or farming or whatever they're doing, it is a ministry. And I know we all get that on the test. We answer the question right, but we so much of the time don't live and think as though that's the case. We compartmentalize them. So this is really just helping pastors get back to some of those fundamentals of you can serve God and be in the marketplace. And I'm a both and kind of thinker and want to help a bunch of other pastors go there as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. So let's just kind of break this down practically speaking. So obviously pastors, I don't know how much money pastors make, but it seems they don't make much money and they struggle financially, right? So you guys are kind of coming in and helping bridge that gap, saying, okay, well, you want to do your ministry, but you can do both. You can make some money plus do your ministry. But pastors are typically... they're leaders. They're leading this church, whether it's a small church or a large church, doesn't really matter. It's still a lot. So they're running this church. What are some simple pathways? Where do they start, I guess? So you talk to this pastor. He's kind of overwhelmed anyways, but he can't hardly pay his bills sometimes, and he's struggling just to do some of those extra things. So where do you start with him? Les, you take us into that.
Well, there are three big categories or three large paths that we've developed to sort of categorize different people in. And just, to look at the big rocks, there's this informational path. Some people would call it kind of creating a platform that might be, and that's using your, in a pastor's case, intellectual property to come up with different deliverables. So it might be a podcast platform. It might be writing and publishing. It could be blogging. It could be YouTube videos. It could be courses, Bible courses, devotional, all of that and more. Pastors, once you're preparing basically a thesis or a midterm every week, on Sunday morning, sometimes Sunday night, sometimes Wednesday night, sometimes a men's Bible study or something else. And after a few years, there's volumes that you have that it's a shame to let it just kind of sit in a file folder somewhere. So deliverables, that's the informational path. And then there's a service-based path. We've got people that are in our community that have pressure washing businesses, real estate businesses, and we're probably going to create a separate category altogether for real estate people, because it seems like a lot of people are kind of in that space. So anyway, that's the second one, the service based. And then the third category is e-commerce. So we have people that are doing real well with Amazon and eBay or a local something on Facebook or something, marketplace, and are doing really well. So again, we're adding. We're having more and more authors in our community. That's informational path, but it's kind of a niche all in its own. So we're serving more authors now and helping them get books published. We actually have our own imprint now. Entrepastors Press is an imprint of Morgan James Publishing. So we have our own publishing house now. We're helping pastors publish. But those three areas are the big categories. And Jon, you can dive down deeper there.
Well, just the only thing I would add to that is when you ask the question, Brett, about where would a pastor start, we want them to kind of look inward and just say, what are you passionate about? What would you love to do? What is something you're interested in or skilled in? Because we believe that those skills and passions and interests can be leveraged and monetized to, serve people and make a decent income as you're doing that. So that's, I would just say start with that assessment. As a matter of fact, we have a free get started guide that we offer to anyone who's interested. If they go to entrepastors.com/start, we have a free download there that kind of walks them through a process and gives over 50 different ideas of, side hustles or side jobs that they could start looking at to get started.
Yeah. What about you guys personally? So we talked about deliverables, service, e-commerce, but it sounds like you guys did some deliverables with the podcast and done some things like that. You guys are now coaching and consulting others, but was there some other things that you guys did in your past, Jon?
Well, before I went into pastoral ministry, I was a firefighter. So my story took me from firefighting to pastoral ministry, back into full-time firefighting, which I still do, and then launching a business on the back of a podcast that I had started. And it was years into that process where I hired a coach for myself who helped me see, Jon, you've been coaching people for years, but you've been doing it all for free because that's what we do in ministry. We're told this is just part of my job as a pastor. So for the longest time, I just saw that as an extension of my pastoral ministry. It wasn't until a coach helped me get the clarity that you could actually build a business around this. It's the same skill set. It's all the same ministry. It's just way more profitable to package it in a LLC as a business and, deliver it in that way. So yeah, that was kind of my pathway into that.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, when you start talking about coaching and consulting, it's funny how that is just a very normal thing in my world. Like as business owners, I have coaches for everything. It's like, if I want to get in shape, I'm going to hire a coach. If I want to write a book, so I'm writing a book right now, I hired a writing coach. If I want to, so I just learn from coaches. But is that normal? Like does everybody, not everybody thinks like that, right? Les, you take that one.
Not in ministry, they don't.
Yeah.
It's something once the model gets larger and more complicated and there's more staff, and leadership blind spots can be exposed with someone perhaps maybe even somebody that's not quite as seasoned as a leader, but they're gifted as a communicator. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they'll go into a church culture that's very complicated with many layers, with some strong leaders, and people often recognize, hey, this young guy needs some help here. And so because they're in the same world as you are, they'll find an executive coach or a pastor's coach or somebody like Jon and I to come alongside of them to help them. But in the smaller settings, which is most of them, 90+%, that's not the case. They don't look outside themselves. They often won't ask for help. They see it as a sign of weakness, or else some kind of a question about their calling. Like, God called me to this. He equipped me to this. I ought to be able to be up to the task. So what you're talking about in many ways is a foreign concept, but we hope we're really trying to change that. And even with pastors that have this itch, that it's an entrepreneurial itch. They just don't know why. They don't know how to scratch it. Even when they start being successful, there's nobody to tell it to.
Right.
There's nobody to share it with. You can't stand up on, I
just made $10,000. Like you can't do that at your church. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
but
that's not real popular.
It's not. So one of the things that we're doing is provide a community and an environment where that's celebrated, not only celebrated, but encouraged. And we want to help, people get there if that's what they desire anyway. So, but to answer your question, it's not common.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely, wouldn't think so in that world. So Les too, I asked Jon the same question, but Les, how did you scratch your entrepreneurial? So I know you're doing this now, but you talked about you worked as a grocery store manager as well, but
I did.
Yeah. What was some of the things that you've done?
Yeah, well, I was in the grocery business, and I saw my dad model. I didn't know it was called. I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. I remember one time walking through my house, and on a coffee table there was a magazine. It was an entrepreneur magazine. I'd never seen the word, and I'm sure I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. But I was like, what is this word, and what does it mean? And he was that guy. He was also a bivocational pastor in not when I was a child, but in my teen years and later. But he always had some kind of side things going on. So he would go to, flea markets, and we had a consignment store that I worked in for a little while as a teenager. And so I kind of saw him always have other things going on. And I don't know, when I got to the point in my life where other doors started opening up, I began to write and publish some. And then I started a blog. And then as podcasting kind of came online, I began to do that and noticed that all those old gatekeepers that you used to have to get past to do a lot of that were gone.
Yeah.
And now we could, if we were willing to put the time in and put the work in, we could get up there and do it. And so I really saw those things as an expansion at first to a preaching and teaching ministry. And so then as I got a little bit better at those things, I did some courses and published some more books and things. And then I saw this thing can and then I started coaching as well, because I had a business coach who said, dude, this is what you need to be doing. And I thought, it didn't sound like me, but as I thought about it, just like Jon, I thought, this is what I've been doing, man.
That's right.
I just had to get comfortable with saying, and this is a business.
Yeah.
So rather than I coach people, I learned to say, hey, I've got this coaching business.
Yeah.
And somebody doesn't have to be very bright to understand, if you put business on the, in that phrase, somebody's going to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
no,
that's when the light really, the bulb really came on for me.
Yeah. And really you're just really going off. Sometimes we get hung up on, even if we are successful, we don't know if we can actually coach. And I can get hung up on that as well. Like, what do I have to offer? I mean, but I've experienced a lot, right? And it's really just walking with someone, right? It's walking, just like as a pastor, you're walking with them through and just using your own experiences. Jon, let's just talk about, so you got this busy pastor and you're talking to him and he's not making enough money, wants to make some more money, wants to start a little business, but his first question or obstacle, he's going to raise his hand and say, you know what, I don't have time to do that.
Right. And they tell us, Brett, that depending on what statistics you read, that anywhere from 1,500 to 1,700 pastors per month quit ministry and walk away. Now, many of those do not do that in a healthy way. They leave in a very unhealthy way. I believe that's a deep issue. There's probably several major reasons for that. But one of them is exactly that. It's pastors that feel already overwhelmed with with heavy expectation that they can never seem to live up to. And now here comes Jon and Les saying, hey, here's an idea, start a business too. So it sounds very counterintuitive, but where I see this being a solution to several major problems that pastors deal with is it forces an issue that has become a real issue in the church, especially in our modern Western culture, where we've created this professional role as a pastor. And I want to be very clear, there's nothing wrong. A pastor, biblically speaking, is doing nothing wrong if their sole income comes from the church. But there's been a byproduct of that, where as a whole, the church has sat back and put all this expectation on the shoulders, usually of one person, maybe a very small team of people. And we basically say to them, you are our hired hand. You do the work of the ministry. We'll all come and watch you produce, and we'll consume the content that you've made on Sunday, and then we'll go home for the week, come back and do it again. You're our hired hand. And so that's just not the biblical model. The biblical model says that God has given these different leaders to the church to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. The real work of ministry is actually supposed to be getting carried out by the people in the pews, not necessarily the pastors. The pastors are the equippers. And so what I love about this is when we get a pastor that is freed up to go out in the marketplace and do some other things, it forces them to delegate. It forces them to equip and hand ministry off to real people in the body to carry the weight of that, which is how it was supposed to work in the first place. So as counterintuitive as it sounds, this actually forces a pastor to get a little bit more dialed in with their own time, their own calendar, and can actually create some margin in their life. And so you'll only know it if you do it. I know it sounds like that's impossible. You're saying I can have more margin by doing more. The answer is yes. Like the people who are really getting stuff done in life are those that have learned to kind of delegate and hand stuff off and do what they do well and do it best. So anyway, yes.
No, preach it, brother. No, I definitely, I was reading this leadership book, and the best leaders, whether in business or in ministry, they can grow their capacity. So if you take a step back and you say, okay, I don't have time, but how can I grow my time? How can I grow that capacity? And you just start to look at these little things and delegate this here and there. But that's the best leaders if they can grow their capacity. So, before we wrap up the show here, maybe any real life stories. I know you guys talked about your own self, but is there a result, a little story that you might share with, you don't have to use names or anything like that, but Les, like what have you kind of seen as you started to work with pastors on this?
We've got several stories of people that go everywhere from informational based path all the way through service based and the other categories we mentioned. So we just had one member of our community that he's the pastor of a local church. He's got a growing ministry. He's very effective. He just sort of wanted to get out in the world again or the marketplace again and use his hands. He's not a sit really behind a desk kind of guy. And so he actually got another guy in our community that's been entrepreneur for a long, long time and pastor of a local church. He's got a pressure washing business. And he just thought, I'd like to do that. And so the guy that already has the established business came alongside and used some of the principles that we're teaching, and we made that connection. And now he's got his own pressure washing business, and it's doing really well, and he's having a lot of fun, and it's going really, really well. You're looking at two examples of that. Jon and I are still creating things, and we're doing things together. We're doing things also on our own in the informational based path, but also in some other areas too. So like, Jon, I don't want to, put words in your mouth, but one of the things that Jon's recently started a business with his son. He's also doing a lot of study and work in the real estate space. So that's probably coming as well. I'll stop there, Jon. You can probably share.
I got a few more that are coming to my mind. One is we've got someone in our community that she and her husband together have launched an archery business. They're both very passionate in that space and have now launched a business around that, teaching archery, and they're building a range together. The other thing in our community, we've found several pastors that I don't necessarily take credit for the success that they're having. They were already in this space, but once they found the community that we're creating with our Entrepastors podcast and our community, they finally kind of found their tribe. And this has been interesting to me, Brett, is how come we don't know their stories? How come you don't hear the stories of a pastor that is successful in church ministry, but also has a franchise of restaurants or, multiple successful businesses and are, very wealthy not because of the church offerings, but because of the business? How come you don't hear those stories? It's because most pastors can't celebrate that. Like we were talking about earlier, most pastors can't get up in their congregation and say, praise God, I just had a $50,000 sale this week or whatever. And in the business community, that's just normal business. People celebrate it and applaud it. Pastors cannot celebrate that. So we've got a number of pastors, like I just described, that were already doing some really great things, just flying under the radar and not really putting their head up above the water too much because they just don't really want people to know that. They don't have a community that they can really be known to that level of how successful their businesses really are. Yeah. And that says a lot. That really goes deeper into what does that say about the culture in the church, where we've come to just accept in our mind, we're all very comfortable with a pastor who struggles financially. Like that just kind of fits what pastoring is supposed to look like. We're good with that. If our pastor can't really take a nice vacation or drive a newer vehicle, but we get a little uncomfortable when we see our pastor living a large life, not from the church offerings, but from their business. It says something about the state of the church and where this whole mindset is at. It's not just a mindset pastors are dealing with. It's the people as well. So anyway, we have a number of pastors in our community that are already just doing great things, and we're just kind of helping support that as they continue that journey.
Yeah.
No. We had a church planner recently join us who was also a first responder. So he and Jon connected right away. He's in the fire services space as well, and he was wanting to write a book. And so he had a partner that he's wanting to write some things with, and came alongside of him. And I'm like the writing coach is for you. I'm helping them there in that regard. And so they actually have a book contract now. It's going to be by a traditional publisher, and that's going to be coming out in the next few months.
That's awesome.
And we've got 2 or 3 books like that, authors in the pipeline that are like that. And that's really kind of what their dream is.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool. I mean, I've always wanted to write a book, but I'll tell you, I've owned my own business for about 15 years, and I do real estate business, investing and stuff like that. But writing a book has been one of the most challenging things I've done. I'm about 75% done with my first draft now. I've been doing it for, awesome. It was a 90-day program, which, writing a book in 90 days, that's pretty tough for me, at least. Yeah. So, but I think, but you also mentioned just pastors. I always wondered, I'm like, because I go to my church and I always ask myself, how do they do that every single week? Come out with this 20-minute, 30-minute message. I mean, that would be really hard. I mean, but I think that the gift that pastors have, that talent, is coming along someone, and they can create and craft that message. They can put that together, put that outline together, make it make sense, and I don't know. So like, that's one gift I think that pastors can really help everybody, especially like, writers or speakers or whatever that is. So.
Right.
Yeah. No doubt.
Pastors have been content creators long before that was a cool thing to say you're a content creator. Pastors have been creating content every single, 7 days, every Sunday. And in many cases, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this, but in old school, like I grew up in, you got pastors that preach Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, like they've got multiple things they're producing content for. So we just think down that informational pathway, that's a natural fit for many pastors. Some want out from behind the desk. They're like, I'm already there enough. But for others, it's like, man, that's their strong suit. Mm-hmm. And it's just a matter of repackaging and repurposing some of that content, or again, just to go into a whole new line of something they're passionate about. That's something we tell pastors. It just doesn't have to be Bible stuff or sermon stuff. This can be about radio controlled airplanes. If that's your passion, like you can create content around anything and, serve people in that space. But it's a natural fit for pastors that are already doing so much of this as a part of their daily work.
Yeah. So cool, guys. Well, thank you so much for being on the Brett Snodgrass podcast today. Really appreciate it. One last thing I just want to kind of point out, where can they go Entrepastors?
Tell them, Les.
Well, go to Entrepastors.com. That's the first place, the easiest place. If you want to get that Get Started guide that Jon mentioned earlier, it's just Entrepastors.com/start. There's lots of ideas in there and just something to get you going. If you're already going and you're looking for a community to celebrate with, get new ideas and get to know people just like you, then we have a community for that. So, but it's all at Entrepastors.com. So thanks for giving us a chance to share that.
Yeah, sounds good. We're going to put that in our show notes too, on our description on our YouTube channel, guys. So go check that out right now. And that's a wrap. Thank you, Jon. Thanks, Les, for being on the show today.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank
we
you,
appreciate
Brett.
it, man.
Thank you.